The moment you decide you already know someone's story is the moment you stop seeing the truth. The sharp crack of breaking safety glass echoed across the visitor parking lot outside Orion Global Security Headquarters in Houston, Texas, turning quiet morning conversations into stunned silence. Office employees slowed their pace. Security officers looked toward the sound. Visitors waiting near the entrance froze where they stood. Beside a polished black luxury sport utility vehicle, Marcus Carter remained completely still. He was a 44-year-old black man wearing a charcoal jacket over a crisp white button-down shirt, and despite the attention suddenly focused on him, his expression never changed. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply looked through the broken driver's side window before lowering his eyes to the electronic key fob resting in his hand. Across from him stood Officer Ethan Collins, a white police officer whose posture reflected confidence built from years of experience. Moments earlier, he had responded to a report describing a luxury vehicle parked near the executive entrance under circumstances another caller considered suspicious. When he arrived, he found Marcus standing beside the vehicle and several details that appeared unusual. The engine was off. The driver was nowhere inside. The vehicle had been sitting in the same place for several minutes. Repeated phone calls had appeared on the dashboard display before disappearing again. Ethan believed he needed immediate access to the interior to verify the situation, and after making his assessment, he entered the vehicle through the damaged side window. Now he faced the quiet owner of the unanswered questions. Or at least, that was what he believed. "Sir, I need you to explain why you have been standing here," Ethan said in a firm but controlled voice. Marcus met his eyes calmly. "I am waiting." "Waiting for who?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "The person I am scheduled to meet." Ethan looked around the nearly empty executive parking area. "Do you have identification?" Marcus slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and handed over his driver's license without making any sudden movement. Ethan examined the card carefully before returning it. "Does this vehicle belong to you?" Marcus paused for only a second. "I am responsible for it today." The answer sounded unusually precise. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "That is not what I asked." Marcus remained composed. "It is the most accurate answer I can give." Several employees quietly gathered near the building entrance, pretending to continue their conversations while watching every word exchanged between the two men. A pair of corporate security officers stood several yards away, clearly aware that something unusual had interrupted the beginning of an otherwise ordinary workday. Marcus glanced briefly at the watch on his wrist. 9:26. Then he looked back toward Ethan without saying another word. The silence only deepened the officer's suspicion. Ethan looked through the broken window again. A premium leather portfolio rested neatly on the center console beside a company access badge, while the dashboard suddenly illuminated with another incoming call. Large letters appeared across the display. "Head of Security calling." The phone continued ringing for several seconds before the screen returned to normal. Ethan looked back at Marcus. "Why are you ignoring those calls?" Marcus answered softly. "Because I need to stay exactly where I was instructed to remain." Ethan folded his arms. "Who instructed you?" Marcus looked toward the headquarters entrance instead of answering immediately. "The person I am waiting for." Another minute passed. The breeze carried the sound of distant traffic beyond the campus gates, while sunlight reflected across the polished black paint of the sport utility vehicle. More employees quietly slowed as they walked into the building, curiosity spreading from one conversation to another. Marcus checked his watch again. 9:28. There was no frustration in his face. No fear. Only patience. Ethan noticed the repeated glance at the time. "You seem very confident that someone is coming." Marcus finally allowed himself a faint smile. "Not confident, officer. Certain." Before Ethan could ask another question, the main entrance doors opened, and a sharply dressed executive stepped outside, scanning the parking lot with calm purpose before walking directly toward Marcus without the slightest hesitation. The executive crossed the polished stone walkway with steady confidence, never looking toward the damaged window or the gathering crowd until he reached Marcus Carter. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Employees who had been whispering among themselves became silent. Corporate security officers straightened their posture. Even Officer Ethan Collins instinctively watched the approaching man more carefully than before. Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing since the beginning of the encounter. As the executive stopped beside him, Marcus extended the electronic key fob without saying a single word. The executive accepted it with an appreciative nod before offering a warm smile. "Right on time, Marcus," he said calmly. "Exactly 9:30. Marcus returned the smile. "I wanted to make sure everything stayed on schedule." Ethan studied the interaction carefully. There was obvious familiarity between the two men. This was not the greeting of strangers. It was the greeting of professionals who had worked together many times before. The executive looked briefly at the damaged driver's side window before returning his attention to Marcus. "Did anything happen before I arrived?" Marcus answered honestly. "Officer Collins had questions about the vehicle. I answered everything I could." Ethan stepped forward respectfully. "Sir, I am Officer Ethan Collins with the Houston Police Department. I responded after receiving a report concerning suspicious activity involving this vehicle." The executive acknowledged him politely. "I understand. Thank you for responding." His calm tone contained neither criticism nor frustration. It reflected the confidence of someone accustomed to solving problems without creating unnecessary conflict. Ethan glanced toward the luxury sport utility vehicle. "Sir, may I ask whether you know this gentleman?" The executive smiled without hesitation. "Very well." Marcus quietly folded his hands in front of him while the growing audience watched every exchange. Another employee stopped several yards away after recognizing the executive. A pair of maintenance workers carrying equipment slowed their pace, sensing that something significant was unfolding. The executive reached into the inside pocket of his navy business jacket and removed a black leather credential holder. He opened it toward Ethan with deliberate clarity. The polished identification card displayed his photograph, executive credentials, and official position. Richard Lawson, Head of Security, Orion Global Security Headquarters. Ethan read every line twice before lifting his eyes back toward the executive. The confidence that had guided his earlier decisions gave way to careful reflection. Richard closed the credential holder and placed it back inside his jacket. "Marcus has worked with our executive security division for several years," he explained. "This morning I assigned him the responsibility of delivering this vehicle and the inspection documents waiting inside before our quarterly security readiness review." Ethan immediately looked through the damaged window toward the premium leather portfolio, resting exactly where Marcus had left it. Richard noticed the movement. "Those documents are scheduled for review in just a few minutes." Marcus glanced once more at his watch before quietly saying, "We still have enough time." Richard nodded approvingly. "Because you remained exactly where I instructed you to stay." Ethan felt the entire morning beginning to reorganize itself inside his mind. Every detail that had once appeared suspicious suddenly carried a reasonable explanation. The repeated phone calls had come from Richard. The precise answers Marcus had given were not evasive. They had been truthful without violating executive confidentiality. His refusal to leave the vehicle had not reflected defiance. It reflected responsibility. Ethan slowly asked the question that now mattered most. "Does this vehicle belong to your department?" Richard answered with complete certainty. "It belongs to me and is assigned for executive security operations." The surrounding employees quietly exchanged surprised glances. A few lowered their phones. Others simply watched in silence as the misunderstanding became impossible to ignore. Marcus never interrupted. He never reminded anyone that he had spoken honestly from the beginning. He simply waited with the same patience that had defined every moment since the first question was asked. Richard looked calmly toward the damaged window one final time before returning his attention to Ethan. "Officer, I appreciate your willingness to respond when something appears unusual. Public safety depends on responsible professionals. But every situation deserves enough time for the complete truth to arrive before conclusions become permanent." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, understanding those words carried far more weight than criticism ever could. Officer Ethan Collins remained silent for several long seconds as the morning breeze carried the distant sound of traffic beyond the gates of Orion Global Security Headquarters. The gathering crowd had stopped whispering. Every employee, security officer, and visitor now understood that the encounter unfolding before them was no longer about a suspicious vehicle. It had become a lesson in how quickly assumptions could shape an entire situation before every fact had been revealed. Richard Lawson looked toward the damaged driver's side window without changing his calm expression. The broken safety glass reflected sunlight across the pavement, creating small flashes of light around the luxury sport utility vehicle. He then turned back to Marcus Carter. "Were you able to keep the inspection documents secure?" Marcus answered immediately. "Yes, sir. Nothing inside the vehicle was disturbed." Richard nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Exactly what I expected." Ethan watched the exchange carefully. Every sentence reinforced the same truth. Marcus had never acted defensively because he had never believed he needed to defend himself. His responsibility had always been protecting the assignment rather than proving his own importance. Richard stepped closer to the open window and carefully removed the premium leather portfolio from the center console. He opened it just enough to confirm its contents before closing it again. "Everything is here," he said. "The executive inspection can begin on schedule." Marcus glanced at his watch once more. 9:32. "We still have time." Richard smiled. "Because you stayed exactly where you belonged." Ethan quietly lowered his eyes for a brief moment before speaking. "Mr. Lawson, I owe both of you an apology." Richard met his gaze without hostility. "For what specifically, officer?" Ethan answered honestly. Marcus answered every question truthfully. "I believed I understood the situation before I actually understood it." Marcus looked toward Ethan with the same composed expression that had remained unchanged since the beginning of the encounter. "You responded because someone reported something unusual," he said calmly. "That is part of your responsibility." Ethan nodded. "Yes, but responsibility also requires patience. I should have taken more time before deciding what the facts meant." Richard appreciated the response. Recognizing that difference is how professionals continue improving. Around them, employees slowly returned to their normal routines. Several business executives entered the headquarters building carrying laptops and coffee cups, while security personnel resumed their assigned patrols. The tension that had filled the parking area only minutes earlier gradually disappeared, replaced by the familiar rhythm of a busy corporate campus. One young security officer approached Richard quietly. "Sir, the executive review team has assembled inside the conference room." Richard acknowledged him with a simple nod. "We will be there shortly." Before turning toward the building, Richard faced Ethan one final time. "Officer Collins, the damaged window will be repaired. That is not my greatest concern." Ethan listened carefully. What matters most is that every person who carries authority remembers that first impressions are rarely the complete story. We protect people best when we protect their dignity while searching for the truth. Those words settled heavily in the quiet morning air. Marcus accepted the leather portfolio from Richard and held it carefully beneath one arm. The assignment that had begun before sunrise remained exactly where it had always been. Deliver the vehicle. Protect the documents. Meet the head of security at precisely 9:30. Nothing about that mission had changed despite the misunderstanding surrounding it. Ethan extended his hand toward Marcus with genuine sincerity. "Mr. Carter, I am truly sorry." Marcus accepted the handshake without hesitation. "Thank you, officer." Respect grows strongest after people choose to learn from one another. Richard watched the exchange with quiet approval before motioning toward the headquarters entrance. Together, he and Marcus began walking toward the glass doors while sunlight reflected across the polished building. Ethan remained beside his patrol vehicle, watching them disappear inside, realizing that the most important thing revealed that morning had never been the owner of the luxury vehicle. It had been the character of the man who stood beside it without allowing misunderstanding to change who he was. Inside Orion Global Security Headquarters, the executive conference room reflected the same precision that defined every operation within the organization. A long walnut table stretched beneath soft recessed lighting, while digital displays showed the agenda for the quarterly security readiness review. Department leaders quietly organized their reports as Richard Lawson entered carrying the premium leather portfolio Marcus Carter had protected throughout the morning. Marcus followed a respectful distance behind him before placing additional folders beside each executive seat exactly as planned. Not a single document was missing. Not a single schedule had been delayed. Richard looked around the room with quiet satisfaction. "Thank you, everyone. We can begin on time." Those simple words carried more meaning than anyone outside the room could fully understand. Marcus had completed the assignment despite unexpected complications that could easily have disrupted the entire inspection. Richard waited until the meeting officially concluded nearly 2 hours later before inviting Marcus into his private office overlooking the campus. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, they could see employees moving between buildings, security vehicles completing routine patrols, and contractors arriving for scheduled appointments. Life across the campus had already returned to normal. Richard placed the leather portfolio on his desk before turning toward Marcus. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said. Marcus answered with his usual humility. "I was simply doing the job you trusted me to complete." Richard smiled. "Many people complete assignments. Very few protect them with the patience you demonstrated this morning." Marcus reflected quietly before responding. When people misunderstand a situation, arguing rarely changes their mind. Facts usually arrive with better timing than emotions. Richard nodded with genuine respect. That way of thinking cannot be taught easily. It comes from character. At the same time, Officer Ethan Collins remained seated inside his patrol vehicle in the visitor parking area, completing the final sections of his official incident report. He carefully reviewed every sentence before submitting it, determined that every observation reflected verified facts instead of assumptions. He described receiving a suspicious activity call, locating the luxury sport utility vehicle, encountering Marcus beside it, and later confirming the vehicle belonged to Richard Lawson, the head of security. He also documented that the misunderstanding had been resolved professionally without further incident. Before transmitting the report, Ethan paused. His eyes drifted toward the headquarters entrance where employees continued entering and leaving as though nothing unusual had happened that morning. Yet for him, everything felt slightly different. He realized that the report would preserve the facts, but it could never fully capture the lesson behind them. His radio interrupted the silence with a routine call from his field supervisor requesting a status update. Ethan answered honestly, explaining the complete sequence of events without minimizing his own role in the misunderstanding. His supervisor listened carefully before replying. "Officer Collins, every shift gives us opportunities to strengthen judgment. The important part is whether we recognize them." Ethan acknowledged the message quietly before ending the transmission. He submitted the completed report and stepped out of the patrol vehicle, taking one last look across the parking lot. The damaged sport utility vehicle had already been moved toward the maintenance facility where the broken safety glass would soon be replaced. Physical damage could be repaired within hours. Restoring trust required something far more valuable than replacement parts. Back inside the headquarters, Richard walked Marcus toward the lobby after finishing the executive meeting. Several department managers thanked Marcus for delivering the inspection materials exactly on schedule despite the unexpected interruption. Marcus accepted every compliment with the same modest smile. He never mentioned the misunderstanding outside, never criticized Officer Collins, and never suggested that anyone owed him recognition. Richard noticed that quiet restraint and appreciated it even more than the successful completion of the assignment. As they reached the lobby doors, sunlight streamed through the tall glass entrance, filling the building with warm afternoon light. Richard looked toward Marcus and said softly, "Professionalism is easiest to recognize after it has been tested." Marcus smiled and answered, "Then today was simply another opportunity to protect it." Those words remained with Richard as Marcus stepped outside, carrying nothing except his jacket and the quiet confidence that had never left him from the beginning of the day. The afternoon sun settled gently over Orion Global Security Headquarters as Marcus Carter walked across the executive plaza carrying nothing more than his charcoal jacket folded neatly over one arm. The quarterly security review had ended successfully, department leaders had returned to their offices, and the steady rhythm of the campus slowly replaced the unusual attention that had filled the parking lot earlier that morning. The luxury sport utility vehicle had already been taken to the maintenance garage, where technicians prepared to replace the damaged safety glass. From a distance, the entire campus appeared peaceful again, yet for everyone directly involved, the day had quietly changed something much deeper than a maintenance schedule. Richard Lawson remained inside the executive lobby speaking with several members of the corporate security leadership team. As the conversation concluded, one senior manager looked toward the parking area before turning back to Richard. Marcus handled today's assignment with remarkable professionalism. Richard smiled with quiet agreement. That is exactly why he continues receiving responsibilities that require complete trust. Another executive nodded thoughtfully. Most people would have spent the entire afternoon explaining themselves. He never tried to prove anything. Richard answered without hesitation. People who know the truth rarely feel pressured to compete with assumptions. Those words lingered in the room long after the meeting ended. Outside, Marcus paused near the entrance while waiting for transportation arranged by the executive office. Several employees recognized him from the morning and offered friendly greetings as they walked toward their vehicles. One young administrative assistant approached carefully. "Mr. Carter, I just wanted to thank you for staying so calm today." Marcus offered a warm smile. "Thank you for saying that." She hesitated before asking another question. "Were you never angry?" Marcus looked toward the headquarters building for a brief moment before replying. Being angry would not have changed what was true. My responsibility was to protect the assignment, not my emotions. She quietly nodded, clearly carrying those words with her as she continued across the parking lot. Across the city, Officer Ethan Collins had completed his shift and returned to the precinct. Before leaving for the evening, he stopped by his supervisor's office to discuss the incident one final time. The supervisor listened carefully as Ethan described everything from the initial dispatch call to Richard Lawson's arrival and Marcus Carter's unwavering professionalism. When Ethan finished, the office remained silent for several moments. Finally, the supervisor leaned back in his chair. "What do you believe was the most important part of today?" Ethan answered honestly. "Not discovering who owned the vehicle. Discovering how easily assumptions can appear convincing before every fact is known." The supervisor nodded with approval. "Remember that answer. It will make you a stronger officer than any training manual ever could." Ethan thanked him before leaving the office with a renewed sense of purpose. Later that evening, Richard walked through the maintenance garage where technicians were completing the final inspection of the repaired sport utility vehicle. The replacement window matched the original perfectly, leaving almost no visible sign that anything unusual had happened. One technician handed Richard the electronic key fob. "Everything has been restored, sir." Richard thanked him before looking briefly at the vehicle. Sometimes repairing equipment is the easiest part of any day. The technician smiled politely, unsure of the deeper meaning behind the remark. As dusk settled over Houston, Marcus arrived home carrying the same quiet confidence that had defined him from the beginning of the morning. He placed his jacket over a chair, prepared a simple dinner, and reflected on the assignment that had ended exactly as intended. The documents had been delivered safely. The executive review had remained on schedule. Most importantly, he had never allowed another person's misunderstanding to determine his own character. Across town, Ethan looked out through the windshield of his personal vehicle before driving home. The memory that stayed with him was not the damaged window or the luxury vehicle. It was the image of a man who had answered every question with honesty, remained respectful under pressure, and trusted that the truth would eventually arrive on its own. Ethan understood that real professionalism did not begin after certainty appeared. It began during the moments when certainty had not yet arrived, and respect remained the only decision fully within a person's control. The following morning arrived with the same golden sunlight stretching across the glass towers of Orion Global Security Headquarters. Yet the atmosphere felt noticeably different for the people whose lives had quietly intersected the day before. The repaired luxury sport utility vehicle stood in its reserved executive parking space with a flawless replacement window, leaving no visible sign that anything unusual had ever happened. Employees walked confidently toward the entrance carrying coffee cups, laptop bags, and morning conversations, unaware that the greatest change from the previous day could not be seen with the human eye. It existed in the decisions people would make because of what they had learned. Marcus Carter arrived a few minutes before 8 o'clock, greeting reception staff and security officers with the same calm professionalism that had defined every assignment he accepted. He carried a slim leather portfolio beneath one arm and paused briefly at the reception desk to sign the executive visitor log before continuing toward the security operations office. Nothing about his routine suggested he expected recognition. He believed consistency mattered far more than attention. Inside the executive wing, Richard Lawson reviewed the schedule for another full day of meetings before noticing Marcus approaching through the glass corridor. "Good morning," Richard said with a warm smile. Marcus returned the greeting naturally. "Everything is ready for today's briefing." Richard accepted the portfolio and looked at him thoughtfully. "I have been thinking about yesterday." Marcus answered quietly. "So have I." Richard closed the folder and folded his hands across the conference table. Many people protect their reputation first. You protected the mission first. That difference says more about character than any performance review ever could. Marcus smiled modestly. When the responsibility is clear, everything else becomes easier. Richard nodded with genuine appreciation. That is why trust keeps finding you. Across the city, Officer Ethan Collins began another patrol shift with a perspective shaped by reflection instead of routine. As he inspected his patrol vehicle before leaving the precinct, he remembered the conversation with his supervisor and the calm confidence Marcus had displayed throughout the encounter. During the first service call of the morning, Ethan found himself slowing down before asking his initial questions. He listened completely before forming conclusions, noticing details he might previously have overlooked. The change required only a few extra moments, yet those moments transformed the quality of every conversation. Later that morning, Ethan stopped at a neighborhood coffee shop where several local business owners greeted him warmly. One elderly customer accidentally dropped a folder filled with paperwork across the sidewalk. Ethan immediately knelt to help gather every page before the wind carried them away. The grateful man thanked him several times. Ethan simply smiled and replied, "Everyone deserves a little patience." As he walked back toward his patrol vehicle, those words reminded him of Marcus. Sometimes the most valuable lessons arrive quietly, spoken only once, yet echoed through countless decisions afterward. Back at Orion Global Security Headquarters, Marcus completed another successful assignment before stepping outside during a short break. The warm Texas breeze moved gently through the landscaped courtyard while employees crossed the campus with familiar confidence. A young security trainee approached respectfully. "Mr. Carter, may I ask you something?" Marcus nodded. "Of course." The trainee hesitated before speaking. "How do you remain so calm when people misunderstand you?" Marcus looked across the courtyard for a brief moment before answering. "Because another person's first impression does not have the power to define who I am. Only my own choices can do that." The trainee reflected quietly on those words before thanking him. Marcus continued walking toward the executive entrance with the same steady pace he always carried, never realizing how many people had begun learning from his example without him ever trying to teach them. Meanwhile, Ethan continued driving through Houston with renewed purpose, understanding that authority reached its highest value only when it was guided by humility, patience, and the willingness to let every person's full story unfold before deciding how it should be understood. Several weeks passed, yet the conversation that began in a quiet executive parking lot continued to influence people in ways no official report could ever measure. Orion Global Security Headquarters remained as busy as ever, welcoming executives, contractors, visitors, and employees through its glass entrance every day. The repaired luxury sport utility vehicle came and went without attracting another glance, becoming just another executive vehicle among many others. The broken window had disappeared from sight, but the lesson behind it quietly remained in the minds of everyone who had witnessed that morning. Marcus Carter continued serving the Executive Security Division with the same dependable professionalism that had earned Richard Lawson's trust years earlier. His assignments changed from week to week, yet his approach never did. He arrived early, prepared carefully, completed every responsibility without unnecessary attention, and treated every person with the same quiet respect regardless of title or position. New employees often assumed he had worked for the company much longer than he actually had, because confidence surrounded him naturally rather than being demanded from others. Richard Lawson noticed that several younger members of the security team had started asking Marcus for advice before important assignments. Instead of giving lengthy speeches, Marcus usually answered with only a few thoughtful sentences. One afternoon, a newly hired supervisor asked him what quality mattered most in executive security. Marcus smiled gently before replying, "People usually believe security begins with protecting buildings or information. It actually begins by protecting trust. Once trust is damaged, everything else becomes more difficult to defend." The supervisor quietly wrote those words inside a small notebook he carried throughout training. Richard happened to overhear the conversation while walking through the operations center. He smiled without interrupting because Marcus had expressed the philosophy of the entire department more clearly than any policy manual ever could. Across Houston, Officer Ethan Collins continued performing his daily patrols with a noticeably different approach. His fellow officers gradually observed the change without anyone mentioning the incident directly. Ethan listened longer before making decisions. He asked additional questions during uncertain situations. He encouraged younger officers riding with him to observe carefully before drawing conclusions. One afternoon, a rookie officer asked why Ethan always paused before responding to complicated calls. Ethan looked through the windshield for a brief moment before answering. Because every person has a story that usually begins long before we arrive. If we only look at the final chapter, we rarely understand the whole book. The young officer quietly nodded, recognizing that experience often spoke through simple words instead of dramatic lessons. Later that same week, Richard invited Marcus to attend a leadership development session with several newly promoted managers. Near the end of the meeting, one participant asked Richard what qualities he considered most valuable when choosing someone for sensitive assignments. Richard looked toward Marcus before answering. Competence earns responsibility. Character earns trust. Character is much harder to replace. The room became silent. Everyone understood the difference immediately. Marcus lowered his eyes modestly, uncomfortable receiving public praise, yet grateful that integrity continued receiving recognition without ever asking for it. As the meeting concluded, sunlight filled the executive conference room through the tall windows overlooking the campus. Employees returned to their responsibilities, security officers resumed patrols, and another ordinary afternoon settled over the headquarters. Nothing about the scene appeared extraordinary. Yet hidden beneath the routine was something far more lasting than a repaired vehicle or a completed assignment. A black professional had remained calm when misunderstood. A white police officer had chosen humility instead of pride after discovering the truth. A respected leader had transformed an uncomfortable moment into an opportunity for growth instead of blame. Together, without planning it, they had created a lesson that continued shaping every person willing to carry it forward, proving once again that real leadership does not become visible during moments of comfort. It reveals itself most clearly when dignity remains stronger than misunderstanding and respect arrives before judgment ever has the chance to speak. Autumn arrived in Houston with cooler mornings and longer shadows stretching across the walkways of Orion Global Security Headquarters. Yet the culture inside the organization had quietly grown stronger because of a single unexpected morning that very few people still discussed openly. New employees joined the Executive Security Division every month, and each orientation emphasized professionalism, accountability, and respect. Those values were no longer presented as abstract principles on presentation slides. They had become visible through the daily example of people who lived them consistently. Marcus Carter continued arriving before sunrise on the mornings assigned to executive operations. He greeted reception staff by name, thanked maintenance crews for preparing the building before business hours, and treated every visitor with the same courtesy he extended to senior executives. People often noticed that he never seemed hurried, even when carrying responsibilities involving confidential schedules and high-level meetings. One morning, a recently hired security coordinator asked him how he managed to remain composed while working under constant pressure. Marcus smiled thoughtfully before answering. Pressure does not create character. Pressure simply reveals whether character was already there. The coordinator quietly repeated the sentence to himself before writing it inside his notebook. At nearly the same time, Richard Lawson addressed a leadership workshop attended by supervisors from several regional security offices. Near the end of the session, one participant asked what quality separated dependable professionals from exceptional leaders. Richard paused briefly before answering. Knowledge helps people solve problems. Integrity helps people prevent them. When others trust your character, they begin trusting your judgment. Several managers nodded as they recognized the truth behind those words. Richard never mentioned the parking lot, the luxury sport utility vehicle, or the misunderstanding that had inspired his reflection. He did not need to. The lesson had already become part of the culture surrounding him. Across Houston, Officer Ethan Collins had also discovered that small changes repeated every day eventually transformed larger habits. During a routine call involving a confused visitor outside a financial office building, Ethan noticed himself asking calm questions before making assumptions. The conversation ended within minutes because the visitors simply needed directions after becoming disoriented. As Ethan returned to his patrol vehicle, his younger partner smiled. You have a way of slowing situations down without making anyone feel uncomfortable. Ethan looked through the windshield for a moment before replying. People usually become easier to understand when they realize someone is willing to listen first. The partner nodded, recognizing that wisdom often sounded surprisingly simple. Weeks later, Ethan unexpectedly returned to Orion Global Security Headquarters while following up on a community safety meeting hosted by several local businesses. After finishing the meeting, he noticed Marcus crossing the executive courtyard carrying another leather portfolio beneath his arm. Their eyes met, and both men smiled naturally before walking toward each other. Ethan extended his hand without hesitation. It is good to see you again. Marcus accepted the handshake warmly. You as well, officer. There was no awkwardness between them, only mutual respect earned through honesty and growth. Ethan looked around the campus before speaking again. I wanted you to know something. That morning changed the way I approach every call. Marcus answered quietly. Then something good came from it. Ethan nodded. More than you probably realize. Before either man could continue, Richard Lawson stepped through the entrance and noticed them talking. He walked over with a welcoming smile. I had a feeling the two of you would eventually meet again. The three men stood together beneath the warm afternoon sunlight, while employees passed nearby, without paying much attention. To everyone else, they looked like three professionals sharing an ordinary conversation. Yet each of them understood they were standing inside the final chapter of a lesson that had begun with misunderstanding and ended with respect. None of them had been changed by power, position, or public recognition. They had been changed by choosing dignity when misunderstanding seemed easier, humility when pride seemed tempting, and truth when assumptions appeared convincing. Those choices would continue traveling far beyond the walls of Orion Global Security Headquarters through every conversation, every decision, and every life they quietly influenced afterward. The conversation beneath the autumn sunlight ended with three simple handshakes before each man quietly returned to his own responsibilities. Richard Lawson walked back toward the executive entrance where another leadership meeting awaited him. Marcus Carter continued across the campus carrying the familiar leather portfolio that had become a symbol of trust rather than paperwork. Officer Ethan Collins returned to his patrol vehicle and resumed serving the people of Houston with a perspective that had been permanently reshaped. Life moved forward exactly as it always does, not through dramatic endings, but through ordinary days quietly influenced by extraordinary lessons. Months later, Orion Global Security Headquarters welcomed a new group of security professionals for orientation. During the final session, Richard stood before the class and spoke without using slides or prepared notes. Every person who enters this campus carries a story you cannot see, he began. Some arrive wearing expensive suits. Others arrive wearing work boots. Some drive luxury vehicles. Others arrive in borrowed cars. None of those details tell you who deserves respect. Respect must come first. Understanding comes afterward. The room remained completely silent. Every new employee listened carefully because the words sounded less like instructions and more like principles that had already been tested by real life. Marcus stood near the back of the room organizing visitor credentials, quietly smiling as he listened. He knew exactly where those lessons had come from, yet he never felt the need to explain his own role in them. Character never asks for recognition. It simply continues doing the right thing after everyone else has stopped watching. Across the city, Officer Ethan Collins had become one of the most respected field training officers in his precinct. Younger officers often requested to ride with him because they admired his calm judgment during uncertain situations. One afternoon, a recruit asked him what advice he wished someone had given him at the beginning of his career. Ethan looked through the windshield before answering. Never confuse confidence with certainty. Confidence helps you act. Patience helps you understand. The strongest decisions require both. The recruit quietly wrote the sentence inside a small notebook that remained in his uniform pocket every day afterward. Ethan smiled, realizing that wisdom often travels from one generation to the next through conversations so ordinary they almost go unnoticed. Back at Orion Global Security Headquarters, another executive inspection concluded successfully, and Marcus prepared the familiar luxury sport utility vehicle for its next assignment. As he closed the driver's side door, sunlight reflected across the flawless replacement window. No visible trace remained of the misunderstanding that had once centered around that same vehicle. Yet every time Marcus looked at it, he remembered something far more important than broken glass. He remembered that dignity had remained intact when everything else briefly appeared uncertain. Richard joined him beside the vehicle before handing over another electronic key fob. "Ready for another assignment?" he asked. Marcus smiled warmly. "Always." Richard nodded with complete confidence. "I never have to wonder whether you will protect the mission." Marcus answered quietly. "Trust is something people loan us every day. I simply try to return it in better condition than I received it." Richard laughed softly before watching Marcus drive toward the executive gate. It was an ordinary afternoon, another routine assignment, another familiar departure. Yet the quiet confidence behind those moments represented something much greater than routine. It represented the kind of character that remains steady regardless of misunderstanding, recognition, or circumstance. Somewhere else in Houston, Ethan guided another young officer through a routine service call with patience instead of haste. Somewhere inside the headquarters, Richard continued building a culture where integrity mattered more than appearances. Somewhere along another quiet roadway, Marcus continued carrying responsibility with the same humility that had always defined him. None of them knew how many lives would eventually be influenced by the choices they made that single morning. Perhaps they never would. Some acts of character never become famous. They simply become examples. And sometimes the greatest measure of justice is not that someone powerful is humbled or someone innocent is finally recognized. Sometimes the greatest measure of justice is that everyone involved leaves wiser than they arrived. Because a badge may represent authority, a title may represent responsibility, and a luxury vehicle may represent success, but only character reveals who a person truly becomes when the complete truth finally arrives.